over to huge flocks of black-faced and Cheviot sheep. And there was such a high demand for wool within Britain and Europe at that time. So the crofting system down on the coast was very different to what people had experienced in the inland strat. And this was a land division and allocation of land, this small linear strips of land. And Ian, could we go to the next slide in the slideshow, please? There are maps at the end of the presentation, and I'd just like to show you a couple of slides before we hear from David again. So the crofting system of land division and allocation bore similarities to the earlier development of the Scottish plantation system, which was imposed on the West Indies on a much larger scale by wealthy Scottish colonists growing and trading in sugar and tobacco. Now, if we stop here, this is a map of Demerara, and I'm sure Alan will, I'm sure David will tell us a little bit more about this. But if you can see these linear strips of land on the coast I think it's an east coast of Demerara here, and so this layout, this controlling of land for the plantations. Can we go next to, I think it is the slide above it, please? And if we look, this is a slide of the coast at Helmsdale. And if you look on the left-hand side, this is the crofting townships on the coast. I think this is an area called at Garty Moor, West Helmsdale and Garty Moor. And you can see that this bears very similar resemblance to the plantation map that we just saw in Demerara. And if we look over at the right-hand side, you can actually see an aerial photograph, and that layout of stripped cropped land is, you can see it, it's still present today on the landscape. And David, if I can come to you, if we look at these maps, they kind of bear resemblances, and when I think about it and we delve a little bit deeper, could we say that, I mean, for both these, the landowners are imposing their rights and the power to control where people move and work? You know, that's kind of what I take from this, all those very, very different events leading to that. But this idea of using land to control where people are kind of corralled into, and they're there for a specific reason. And it's the idea of how much output can you get from a specific piece of land. So, David, I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what your take on these maps are, and also what was the general layout of a plantation in Guyana? Could you tell us a little bit so we can get it into our heads?
Okay, I think you're right. The similarity and the link between them, I think, is one of mentality. It is about control. The scale is vastly different because each of the, in Helmsdale, each of these strips is meant to barely provide subsistence for a family because they'll also be involved in fishing. In Guyana, each of these strips will be 250 to 500 acres. So the whole of Helmsdale would fit into one of these strips, and probably quite a lot more as well. But I think there is that similarity in control. There's also, they're both on the coast. You mentioned that they're new creations in Helmsdale. It's been previously uncultivated or not so intensively cultivated ground. That's also true in Guyana, in Demerara. But again, one of the differences there is that they're reclaiming land from the sea. And the work of creating these coastal plantations, the building of dikes and drainage canals, is one of the biggest works of engineering of the early 1800s globally. It's the equivalent, roughly, of digging and creating 300 Caledonian canals. And that's all done by by the hand labour of enslaved Africans. And the layout is in strips like this, and the great attraction of Demerara was it was mainland, it wasn't an island, so you could potentially extend your cultivation further backwards, and the soils had not been depleted as they had been in so many other Caribbean islands. So it's very much a work of control and the creation of a new environment.
Thank you, David. The scale is enormous. I don't think any of us can appreciate the size of some of the plantations and the work involved to bring the land ready for the sugar and the tobacco and crops like that. Yeah, and it's all human labor involved in the whole processing of it. One of the other things I'd like to see is, Ian, could we go back to the start of the presentation? Because I have to say, David, in my wonderful chats, enlightening chats with yourself, one of the things I was really taken with, and I have to say I was very unsettled by this, was when I looked, so it's the naming of places. So we're doing a place name project at the moment, and we're in East Sutherland, so we've got and we've got Helmsdale, got Golspie, Brora, Dornoch, we've got Inverness, you've got all these names. But I mean, I was very unsettled to find that these names can be found in Guyana as well. And maybe Ian, if you could just go to the next slide. And Ian, if you could tell us, why are all these names in Guyana?
Well, because these plantations are being created, there's ground that's being created, being reclaimed from the sea, and the people who are doing this are enslaved Africans, but the people who are controlling it are, a very large number of them are from families in the Eastern Highlands, and so they're giving names to their plantations. And Ian, if you this is particularly in Berbice, which is the colony next to Demerara, still part of Guyana. So Ian, if I can just ask you to run through these slides.
I think the first one is the map, David. So Ian, right. It's a bit blurry again. Could we unblur it, please?
I think if this doesn't work, I think if we just run through the next slides, because all of these yellow marks are names of places in the Highlands along the coast.
Me looking at this, David, I think I'm just looking at a map of the coastline of Sutherland or the Highlands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my God.
And here are the places you would go through. So, Ian, can you just run through the slides, Ian, just one after another? Keep going.
Thank you, Ian.
And I'll just talk as they come up. You'll begin to see just the number of places from the East Coast.
Next one, Ian. Oh my God.
Actually, this Kildonan is not named after Kildonan in Sutherland. It's after another Kildonan in Ayrshire. But Kilterran is a huge involvement of Highland Scots there, Robertsons in particular. This would be King Illy in the Highlands, just outside Inverness. Nig, owned by Rosses and Frasers. And this is the Novar, the Hindu temple in Novar, in Berbice. And the Rose Hall sugar factory and plantation named after Rose Hall in Sutherland. There are actually a couple of Rose Halls in Berbice. Just keep going. Darlogie near Tain. And this is actually over the border into Dutch Suriname, Dutch Guyana, Suriname. And the same Scots are involved and the same place names are recurring there. The two buildings in Guyana, wooden buildings which survive and which we know to have been built by enslaved labour, are the two Scots Kirks. The Scots Kirk in Georgetown in Demerara, now the capital of Guyana, and the one you saw earlier, the Scots Kirk in New Amsterdam, which is capital of Berbice. So these are built by enslaved labourers, and in Georgetown they proudly display the Scottish arms on the gallery of the church.
What was the impact of, that's fine, Ian, we can go back to the model now if you don't mind, just give us a nice little aerial tour. Well, I could ask you 100 questions, David, but what was the impact? So we've got local families involved in the, in Guyana, Demerara, wherever it was, but what was the impact back home on family at home? I mean, was money coming back here?
Yes, money was coming back from those who were successful. There's always a significant number of people who die, because particularly once you get into the south of the Caribbean, fevers are very prevalent. So a lot of people die. But what people see are the people who are successful and come back. And sometimes people are using the money that's made to maintain their position in society. People like Lord Seaforth, Chief of Clan Mackenzie, and he invests in Berbice, and his aim is to maintain his position as a clan chief in Scotland. There are others for whom it enables them to rise in the world. Some very, and that's probably or secure their position in the world. People at the time often talk about an independence, having enough money and it seems to be about £3,000 or £4,000. If you could make £3,000 or £4,000, you probably get enough income from that, or you could buy a farm, you could improve it, you could invest. And it gives you that I think it's almost an independence from the vagaries of fortune. You're secure. So a lot of people are aiming for that, and that's what's happening on the east coast of Sutherland. People like the Sutherlands of Midgarty and Donald Sage's relations at Navadale, which is a very early improved farm. And for other people, their rise is meteoric. There's some examples of people who go out with little more than a reasonable education and a letter of introduction, and they end up as landed gentry. I mean, sometimes in England. A man called Donald Mackay goes out from Inverness. Particularly during the period of the African slave trade, which was that was abolished in 1807. Slavery is not abolished, and trade in people is not abolished. But before then, people could go out, work he goes out and works as a clerk in a business run by two Highland Scots. He gets credit from them. You could buy enslaved people in 18 months credit. You could then hire them out to work, not as part of what they called a task gang. And you could gradually build up your holding of slaves, as what he did. And then with a partner, he bought a sugar plantation in another part of Guyana, and then ended up rich. So yes, it certainly happens that people use that money in all sorts of ways. There's a new class of people then, particularly in 1833-34, when compensation is paid, and of course the compensation is not paid to the enslaved, it's paid to the slaveholders. It's the massive amount of £20 million in 1834. And some people then use that to invest in Highland estates, to buy Highland estates, because that has become fashionable. So there's a whole range of impacts, and crucially, I think it's important to realise that it extends throughout society. And asking who benefited from slavery is rather like asking who benefited from North Sea oil.
Yeah.
Now, of course, Mobile and Exxon benefited enormously, but so did lots of people in the Highlands from oil. And the same is true of slavery. And just linking back to an earlier conversation, it permeates the Highlands I'm not quite sure how far this extended into Kelmsdale and Kildonna, but the spinning of linen yarn in the Highlands using imported linen, imported flax, that was being made into yarn, which was being shipped further south and then woven into a rough cloth called slave cloth, which was what was shipped to the colonies to clothe slaves. And some of the grants down in Speyside were specifically weaving tartan woolen cloth to ship to Africa as a trade good to exchange, to buy enslaved people. who were then shipped to the, so, and then cotton, as you said, a little cotton is coming back, and there's the attempt to establish a cotton mill at Spinningdale. So I think that, just following the materials that are being worn, that are being woven, that are being used, shows the way in which it permeated society.
That's absolutely fascinating. Actually, what you touched upon, we're going to look more at in our part 2 of Clearances to Colonialism, when it comes to talking about trade and export and Scottish fisheries as well. One of the questions which I was going to ask you earlier, which I got too mesmerized with everything else, but so in terms of gender, you know, I suppose history always leaves us evidence of men involved in the in this, you know, as a plantation owners, but I've also come across evidence of obviously, you know, husbands would die leaving things to their wives, so I would imagine, you know, women are involved in this as well. I mean, obviously.
Yes. It is very easy for this to become a history of white men if you're looking at it from the Scottish side. But you're right, women are involved. They're even if they a few women from the Highlands do go to the Caribbean, but but not many. And so there is a whole, so sexual abuse of enslaved women is endemic. And there's a whole history there, and the experience of enslaved women and the resistance of enslaved women and of free black and coloured women is, you know, part of this history. Back in Scotland, it is part of how families are sustaining themselves. Women are. I think there are interesting things about gender, and as particularly as the 1800s, as we get into the 1800s and onwards, gender roles, gender and class are interlinked, and roles are changing. And there's an idea of separate spheres, that men go out and work and women are responsible for the domestic sphere. And that in some ways makes it perhaps easier to turn a blind eye to what's happening for women, so they can be complicit without recognizing what's going on. But having said that, I mean, there are quite, from the 1820s in particular, there are very active campaigns among women abolitionists to boycott slave-grown sugar. So, you know, that's a way, that's interesting, because that's the way in which the campaigns for abolition impinge on the domestic sphere, and women, in a way, are being challenged within that gender role to respond to the involvement of slavery by boycotting sugar.
It was just an interesting comment came in, which kind of, it says, women therefore were permitted to inherit their husbands' estates if they, you know, died. And I think I've come across that in some of the research, you know, that it's been inherited, you know, so that's what happened.
Yes, and so people end up as slaveholders, slave owners, simply because they're part of society. They marry, there are marriage settlements, they inherit, and that can come down to the ownership of a single enslaved person. So it is, and that's where the detailed study of the compensation records has moved us from thinking this is about a few big families and a few big merchants and their slave ownership, to see the way in which slave ownership permeated society and involved women as well as men.
Thank you. I mean, again, I can't wait to get your book, David, but also I feel there's so many areas of research that you've inspired that very much needs to be part of research that we do from now on.
Could I just add one thing I realise I haven't mentioned is that, I mean, because there are very few white women in the Caribbean, there is endemic sexual abuse of the enslaved population, and children are born to white Scots and enslaved or free women of colour. And some of them end up in Scotland, including in Helmsdale. And in the terminology of the time, there is a mulatto boy at Wester Helmsdale in around about 1800. And there's another relation of Donald Sage's, who's known as Hector Roberts, because his father is Robert Pope. So he is Robert. So he's Robert's child. So he's brought up near Helmsdale, and he's known as Hector Roberts. And you can find that again, through we look at the schools, we look at the communities, and we will find children of mixed race who are part of, this is part of the legacy of this history.
And we know the Popes is very much involved as wad setters at the, pre-clearances. So it really, they were part of the old kind of sort of sub landowners, or they rented land direct off the landowners, and that land they subleased to tenants as well. So that kind of middle class, I suppose you would call it. Ian, could we go down into the township just as we kind of tie things up here and just visit, because I'm just conscious we've not visited the illicit still and just maybe go into the illicit still and the corn drying kiln, so people viewing can have a look at some of the other interiors. And while we do that, just give us a little tour, thank you very much. So one of the things I was just going to maybe finish off with saying, although I mean it's something we could go on for hours chatting about, is that when I go out into the landscape, I can see evidence of the clearances all around me and the stone footings of the buildings. They're littered all around the upland landscape of Kildonan. We can go up there, we can see it, and there's lots of historical records as well to look at. But when we're looking for evidence and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and where can we find it in the Highlands? I mean, your research into where was the money going, what were they using it for? Can we go somewhere and say that was part of the slave trade?
I think we can certainly go to some big houses and say that was built with money from the slave trade. I live in Cromarty, and I've done bit of work locally. I think this is the only thing, this is stuff you can probably only uncover through good local study. So in Cromarty, I can identify 13 different houses or house sites which have a connection to slavery and the slave trade. And some of these are quite modest houses, and gravestones, I mean, I think is another area. Gravestones a big investment, and it's going to be there for a long time. So it's something people think about and put thought into. And so when you find a gravestone where somebody's being described as Alexander Monroe of Demerara, that's their identity. That's who they've become, even when they come back home. And it's really interesting, I think, to look at how John Ross of Berbice is from Golspie. He becomes a leading figure in Inverness, but he's of Berbice. It's a badge of honour. We find that in gravestones. We find it in documents. But it's a struggle. But I think it becomes something that people want to silence, forget about. So you have to dig, sometimes literally, or sometimes metaphorically, to find the legacy, or handle the legacy.
And certainly, I just feel that you have been presenting talks around the Highlands, Scotland. You've been to Guyana, and you've really helped highlight this. I suppose the inadequate way that Highland history really was presented, and I think museums and with the use of digital technology, and certainly our collections, our archives, we have a responsibility to really, to really, make a point of creating better narratives that encompass the impact of the slave trade and Highlanders' role in that.
And I think that I think the challenge for us is to make sure that we are hearing voices from beyond our boundaries and beyond our comfort zones, from people who share this history, but who have been impacted by it in a quite different way to people within the Highlands. And that's a challenge, but can also, I think, be tremendously rewarding. And I think a lot of what Timespan has done has been to create that forum in which these voices can be heard.
I think it's really, I mean, it's been huge. Every time I listen to what you have to say, David, I realize, and again, I always come at these things from research, and I think local research really has a big part to play in this, and engaging communities, and also being able to have, to having references to read, to have that information made available to everybody, to have local libraries represent this topic, to have our schools teach it. I mean, at Timespan we do a clearances to colonialism tour for the schools, but with COVID it's a bit difficult, so our offer has to be slightly different, and we've got to offer it, but maybe a digital way is the way to go. I see that Alan has come back on here, but I would just like to thank you very much, David, for that hugely informative and important insight today. And it was great, Alan, using the model as a vehicle, a portal to chat about this history. So I think I think, Alan, would you like to sum us up for the end for today? Oh, you can't hear you.
Oh gosh, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for coming along and contributing to what has been a fine discussion. I see that there's been stuff going on in Facebook as well, and watch this space, because I believe that we're going to be doing a follow on to this in a couple of months' time with yourselves again, and with Five we expect to be doing a series of these events looking at heritage online. So that's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so please join us again for part 2, when we'll be looking at the role the Scottish fisheries played. We're going to have archaeologist Kathy Dagg telling us about the herring fishing industry. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Open Virtual Worlds.
Thank you, Jackie.